The weekend. The weekend started innocently enough. My cousin Michael and I had the house to ourselves. Our parents had gone on a weekend trip, leaving us with a stocked fridge, video games, and free reign of the old family house. It was a sprawling place, full of memories and creaky floorboards at the edge of a forest. It had always felt a bit eerie, especially at night, but I never gave it much thought. Until that weekend. Michael was older than I by a few years. He was 17, tall and athletic, with a confident demeanour that I envied. I was 14, lanky and awkward, always trying to emulate his coolness. We had always been close, almost like brothers, so I was excited about the prospect of a weekend without parental supervision. Little did we know, the house had plans of its own. The first night was uneventful. We played video games until our eyes burned, and then watched horror movies, laughing at the over-the-top jump scares. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but it was nothing we weren't used to. The house was old after all, and prone to strange noises. We finally went to bed around midnight, exhausted but content. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Michael getting up to use the bathroom, but the steps were too heavy, too deliberate. They echoed down the hallway, stopping just outside my door. I held my breath listening, but after a moment, the footsteps continued down the hall, fading into the distance. The next morning, I asked Michael if he had heard anything. He shrugged it off, telling me it was probably just the house settling. His nonchalance was reassuring, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the day went on, that feeling grew stronger. We spent the day exploring the woods, finding old trails and reminiscing about our childhood adventures. By the time we returned to the house, the sun was setting and the sky turned darker. We made dinner and settled in for another night of movies and games. As the hours ticked by, a sense of unease began to creep in. It was subtle at first, like a whisper at the back of my mind, but it grew louder with each passing hour. Around midnight, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and the only light came from the pale glow of our phones. Michael cursed, fumbling for a flashlight. The wind outside had picked up, howling like a banshee, and the house groaned in response. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Great," Michael muttered. "Guess we'll have to go to bed early." I nodded, trying to ignore the knot of fear tightening in my stomach. We made our way upstairs. Just as we reached the top of the stairs, I saw it a shadowy figure at the end of the hallway. It was tall and thin, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness. It stood there, watching us. "Michael," I whispered, "do you see that?" He turned the flashlight in the direction I was pointing, but there was nothing there. The beam of light revealed only the empty hallway, lined with old family portraits. Michael frowned, shaking his head. "You're just spooking yourself, Thomas," he said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. We went to our respective rooms, but I couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind and the creaking house. I must have drifted off at some point, because I woke to the sound of whispering. It was soft, almost inaudible, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I sat up, straining to hear. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I got out of bed and opened my door, peering into the hallway. The house was dark and silent, the air thick with an oppressive weight. I took a tentative step forward, then another. As I approached Michael's room, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. I reached out to knock on his door, but it swung open before I could touch it. Michael stood there, his face pale and drawn. "You heard it too?" he asked. I nodded, too scared to speak. We stood there for a moment, staring at each other, before Michael grabbed his flashlight and motioned for me to follow him. We made our way downstairs, the house feeling more like a tomb with each step. The flashlight beam flickered, casting ominous shadows on the walls. In the living room, we found the source of the whispering. The air was cold, our breath visible in the dim light. And there, in the middle of the room, stood another shadow figure. This one was more distinct than the last, its form almost solid. It turned its head towards us, and though it had no eyes, I could feel its gaze piercing into my soul. Michael and I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. The figure began to move, gliding towards us with an unnatural grace. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed Michael's t-shirt, pulling him towards the front door. We stumbled outside into the night, the cold air a shock to us. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the woods. We stopped for a second, gasping for breath. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees and our ragged breathing. "What the F was that?" Michael finally said. I shook my head, unable to find the words. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't human, and I knew it wasn't finished with us. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too scared to go back to the house. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we made our way back, hoping that whatever we had seen was gone with the night. The house was silent, the air no longer cold. We cautiously entered, our nerves on edge. Everything seemed normal, but the sense of unease lingered. We decided to stay outside for the day, avoiding the oppressive atmosphere of the house. As night fell, we knew we couldn't stay outside forever. We needed answers. Armed with flashlights and the few protective charms we could find around the house, we ventured back inside. The shadows seemed to stretch longer. The house was darker than before. We made our way to the living room, the site of the previous night's encounter. The air was thick, heavy with an unspoken menace. Michael and I stood side by side, our flashlights scanning the room. And then we saw the more shadow figures, materializing from the darkness. They surrounded us. They didn't move, just stood there, watching us. I felt a cold dread settle over me, freezing me in place. One of the figures stepped forward, its form more distinct than the others. It raised a hand, pointing directly at us. The whispering began again, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear: anger, malice, hatred. Michael tightened his grip on the flashlight, his knuckles white. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice a strained whisper. We backed away slowly, the figures watching our every move. As we reached the doorway, the figures began to advance, their movements slow but deliberate. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. We ran. The figures followed, their forms shifting and flickering. We bolted up the stairs, slamming the door to my room behind us. Michael pushed a dresser in front of the door. "What do we do now?" I asked. Michael shook his head, looking frightened. "I don't know. What do you want from us?" Michael shouted. As the minutes dragged on, the whispering began again, seeping through the walls, the floor, the very air we breathed. The figures appeared outside the door, their forms pressing against the wood, trying to get in. The flashlight flickered, the beam weakening. "We have to go," Michael said. "We can't stay here." We made a plan to run for my mum's car, hoping to escape whatever was haunting the house. Michael pushed the dresser aside, and we bolted down the stairs. The figures followed, their movements more frantic, more aggressive. We reached the front door, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as though an invisible force was holding it shut. Panic surged through me, and I turned to Michael. "What now?" I asked. Michael looked around us for a way to escape. "The back door," he said, grabbing and pulling me towards the kitchen. We reached the back door, and to our relief, it opened. We stumbled outside, the cold night air hitting us like a slap. The figures didn't follow, but we could still hear the whispering, growing louder and more desperate. We ran to the car, jumping in and locking the doors. Michael fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and finally managed to start the engine. We tore out of the driveway, the house looming behind us like a dark spectre. We drove for what felt like hours, not stopping until we reached Michael's house. We entered through the basement, our nerves frayed, our bodies exhausted. As we lay in the living room, the whispering finally faded, leaving us in blessed silence. The next morning, we returned to the house, determined to face whatever was haunting us. The house was quiet, the air no longer heavy. We cautiously entered, our hearts pounding. The shadow figures were gone, the whispering silenced. We spent the day cleaning, trying to erase the memories of the past 2 nights. But the sense of unease never left. We knew the house was still watching, still waiting. That night, we slept with the lights on, our flashlights within reach. The house was silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, lurking in the shadows. The weekend ended, and our parents returned, none the wiser to our ordeal. We didn't tell them what had happened, not wanting to worry them, but Michael and I knew the truth. The house was haunted, and it wasn't finished with us. As the weeks passed, the memory of that weekend began to fade, but the fear never truly left. Every creak, every whisper of the wind sent a shiver down my spine. I knew the shadow figures were still out there, waiting for the right moment to return. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is dark and silent, I hear the whispering, faint but insistent. It's a reminder that the past is never truly gone, and I know that one day they will come for us again. Well, that's another one for the books. Please like and subscribe. You are awesome. Nighty night.